All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 31, Section 3, Beyond a Bipolar World. So this reference right here, bipolar world, is a reference to the Cold War, which of course sees, the two ideologies, capitalism versus communism. So this touches upon some of the events between 1945 and 1975 that aren't necessarily related to that, or at least try and distance themselves from kind of the overarching theme in this particular period in world history, and that, of course, is the Cold War. Now, there was a term used to describe those nations that were not allied with either the Soviets or the Americans. We call this the Third World. So the Third World are nations not allied with the United States United States or Soviet Union. In 1955, in Bandung, Indonesia, a number of states met to really kind of proclaim their non-aligned status. So the Bandung Conference was a meeting of third world nations. Here we have two leaders. This is Nehru of India and Nasser of Egypt. It also included, of course, Indonesia, but a lot of other emerging newly independent nations. And what they wanted essentially to say here at the conference was to a meeting of the third world nations to proclaim, we might say neutrality, neutrality in the Cold War. Of course, this was a little bit more complicated than stated. Oftentimes, nations proclaim themselves as being non-aligned, but when Soviet or American influence could help those nations, they might kind of play both sides of the Cold War to try to get some sort of benefit from it. An example of this is Egypt. Egypt was a nation that, of course, was formerly under the influence of Great Britain. It proclaimed or was granted its independence under Great Britain, but a nationalist leader emerged in Gamal. I don't know if that's actually spelled correctly. I think it's Abdel. I don't think there's a space. Maybe there's not. But anyways, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was what we might call an Egyptian nationalist. And maybe a pan-Arabist, right? Pan-Arabism was this idea that all Arab nations ought to unite. Egypt, in a lot of ways, was one of the leading nations in the Arab world between 1945 and 1975. And part of the reason why was because Nasser was successful in nationalizing the Suez Canal. If we recall, Great Britain had granted Egypt their independence with special conditions. That condition was that the Suez Canal stay in Great Britain's control. Essentially, what Nasser did was to seek Soviet help. Right, the Soviet Union had a vested interest in undermining British authority. When Nasser attempted, or when Nasser did nationalize or take back the Suez Canal from British control, Great Britain, Israel, and France all attacked Egypt. This was sometimes called the Suez Crisis. However, both the Soviet Union and the United States intervened to cause the British and the French and Israel to back down. And essentially, Nasser was successful in maintaining or reclaiming the Suez Canal from Great Britain. And so he was seen as very much a figure that was willing and able to stand up to Western authority with, of course, the caveat of Soviet help. Egypt would continue to receive Soviet aid, but would also, distance themselves from the Soviet Union later on in an effort to try to gain more, American aid. And that was sometimes how sort of non-aligned nations could work both sides of the Cold War. Meanwhile, in Japan and China in East Asia, Japan was pretty much, Japan was conquered by the US. Recall the atomic bombs. So as opposed to other nations that were defeated in World War I, like Germany, Germany was divided. Korea was divided. Because Japan was, pretty much solely taken out by the United States, it was the reconstruction or rebuilding was a U.S. monopoly. The United States created a Japanese constitution. They modeled after the U.S. one. So the U.S. pretty much wrote the constitution or wrote the government of Japan, modeled after U.S. constitution. Sometimes called democracy from above, right? Kind of forced down on Japan. And especially after the events of China, in which Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China in 1949, right? China became a communist state. Oops. The United States looked towards Japan as a major kind of base to operate the Cold War in Asia. So Japan went very quickly from a nation in which the United States really sought the utter destruction of it during World War II to a state in which the United States wanted to quickly, economically, and militarily rebuild Japan because it would operate as a base for which the United States could, conduct the Cold War in Asia, especially to counterbalance China. So we might say economic development encouraged by U.S. to counter China, right, or Chinese influence. Mao Zedong, as we said, he is the communist leader. Really ever since the 1920s, from about 1927 to 1949, China was stuck in a civil war. The civil war was the communists versus the nationalists. It was interrupted by World War II, but after World War II ended, it was the communists who eventually won. After that point, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party set forward a very ambitious plan to industrialize. This led to a massive catastrophe in what's known as the Great Leap Forward. We might kind of compare the Great Leap Forward to something like the 5-year plans in the Soviet Union, a state-sponsored, centrally planned effort to try and industrialize. The Great Leap Forward really sought to turn the peasants, who were farmers, into steel producers. It was an absolute catastrophe. Essentially, all the peasants who had been previously growing food to feed China were now forced to produce steel. This led to huge famines, where anywhere from 20 to 30 million people starved to death. This is one of those man-made famines. And this happened, I think, in the 1950s. A little bit later on, the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. By that point, kind of the, maybe the enthusiasm for communist revolution was beginning to fade. The Cultural Revolution was really an effort by Mao to reignite the revolutionary spirit. And you could reignite the revolutionary spirit by essentially rooting out all those people who were not revolutionary enough. So the Red Guard units, these were young, typically young Chinese, who, quote unquote, rooted out, and by rooted out, imprison, kill, executed those who were not revolutionary enough. Right, so a lot of the older, the older Chinese, in some cases, a lot of teachers were rooted out. Rooting out, like I said, could take the form of imprisonment. Sometimes a lot of the bourgeois or more upper classes were sent to perform mandatory labor to get them more in touch with their peasant side, right? That they had kind of forgotten the way of how hard it was for peasants to work. And so there was kind of this re-education through labor, as they call it. It could also hold these like public speeches in which people were humiliated or said that they weren't revolutionary enough. Eventually, it got a little bit too out of control for Mao's liking. A lot of people were killed in this. Perhaps 500,000 people were killed in the Cultural Revolution, and eventually Mao backed down from it, and it sort of faded out, so to speak. One thing to note about China is that even though it was a communist nation, there was always a desire by Mao Zedong and China to retain independence from the Soviet Union. And this was best illustrated by the actions of US President Richard Nixon, so US President. And what he did was to build a more friendly relation with China. And the idea here behind the United States in the 1970s trying to build a better relationship with China was to really stick it to the Soviet Union, right? You can think of the Soviets and the Chinese as supposedly being friends, but then if your friend goes off and is playing footsie with the enemy, of course, in this case being the United States, this is a way to drive a wedge further between the Chinese and the Soviets and really try to isolate the Soviet Union. And it was about this time that the Americans began to realize that perhaps maybe not every single communist regime, although maybe slow to realize, not every communist regime was a puppet of the Soviet Union, which was really a guiding principle of United States foreign policy for a very, very, very long time. In the Middle East also took on a sort of Cold War lens, you might say. However, though, there were other conflicts on the ground that maybe played a more significant role there. Much of the politics around the Middle East centered around the creation of Israel. Now, recall that back during World War I, the Balfour Declaration, right, 1917, was British support to create a Zionist or Jewish state in Palestine. Palestine is this, and we'll look at our map here. Palestine is this area right over here in the Middle East, if you can see that. And so during World War I, and especially after World War II, right, a lot of Jewish people moved into Palestine. That conflicted with the existing population there of Palestinian Arabs, and during British occupation of there were many riots, right? So for example, Palestine was a territory that went from the Ottomans, right, the Ottoman Empire in, we'll say 1920, over to British control, right, at least until 1945. And then, of course, we know that starting in 1945, there was the process of decolonization. So Palestine, which again was under British control from 1920 to 1945, is now going to become independent. And the question is, well, how does Great Britain leave Palestine? And there are two population groups that are more or less vying for control there. Initially, the British turned towards the United Nations, the peacekeeping organization created post-World War II. The United Nations creates a two-state solution in which two different countries will be created, Israel and Palestine. It's very much in the spirit of what Great Britain did in India, where they separated India into India and Pakistan, Muslims and Hindus. Here, the same thing, right? Two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, Israel for the Jewish population, Palestine for the Muslim Arab population. That proposal by the United Nations was rejected. And instead, what occurred was that, really ever since 1948, Israel would declare its independence in 1948, would go to war with their neighbors, and it's really served as kind of an ongoing conflict in the Middle East really ever since. In all the conflicts between Israel and their neighbors, including the 1967 Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, we're typically talking about wars between Israel and other surrounding countries like Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. In all of these conventional wars, Israel was essentially victorious, right? Won all those wars. And this created an independence movement that was less conventional, right? All these wars were more or less conventional, and instead resorted, I think 1973 was Yom Kippur War, resorted to different tactics. So the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, also called PLO, carried out guerrilla might be spelled incorrectly. Guerrilla tactics, right? Also terror tactics. Yasser Arafat was the leader of the PLO. And, the history of Israel and their neighbors has been a very violent one, really ever since the 1940s, 1960s, 1970s. It's changed a little bit. It's less about conventional wars and more about, guerrilla warfare, terror tactics, revenge killings, to be quite honest, and continues to be a site of violence in the Middle East. Also, another thing to take note of is that when Israel won these conventional conflicts, what came with it was, in many cases, more land and more of a Palestinian population. So if we look at our map here of the Middle East, right, we have potentially, a couple of things. So the orange here, let's see if I can see it properly. So the orange here is essentially what was proposed by the United Nations, right? So this would have been Israel. And then the red represents everything that Israel acquired through their wars with their neighbors, right? So Israel, being victorious in their wars, claimed more or less a lot more territory, whereas the orange really represented the places where there was a more dense Jewish population. The red represented the areas that had a larger Palestinian population, and of course, Israel became a much larger nation than what was initially proposed by the United Nations way back in 1948. An important thing to take note of is that Israel's ally, the United States, supported Israel in all of their efforts to, in their conflicts with their neighbors. This caused the OPEC nations, or Organization of Petroleum Exporting Nations. These were mostly Arab nations who opposed Israel and the U.S. to cut off oil from the U.S. So the embargo is an oil embargo. Embargo means to cut off, so oil cut off from the U.S. So these nations no longer sold oil to the U.S., and this caused in the U.S. an energy crisis. The energy crisis you can see illustrated in this picture here. These are cars in the United States in line waiting for gas. In terms of the environment during this post-war era, the post-war recovery, that is the rebuilding, was put some stress on the environment, we'll say that. But really, for like one of the first times, there were countries that were beginning to put in certain environmental protections. The United States, for example, the Clean Air Act, the celebration, or at least the acknowledgement of Earth Day, which recognized the environment as being important, and the creation of the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency. These were all measures to protect the environment.